Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to continue our series on low light practice with the handgun, talking specifically about just the weapon mounted light. If you're just getting into the series, I've been doing a few videos covering the different applications for light and practicing using low light shooting with a handgun, and how, if you don't have access to a range where you can shoot in low light conditions, some of the ways that you can get around that and still practice the techniques that you might need to use a handheld light with a weapon mounted light, or just a weapon mounted light only, if you need to use your firearm, because not everybody has access to a range where they can shoot in darkness, or even if they do, they might necessarily have some other constraints that they can't really work with. So the whole purpose of these videos has been to address each system independently of itself and talk about some of the techniques that you can work into your normal practice. Now, in the last video, we talked about transitioning from a handheld light to a WML, if that's the way to carry. A lot of people carry a handheld flashlight because that should be something that everybody has, but they also have a weapon-mounted light on their handgun. So the transition between the two is something we need to practice, and there's a bunch of different techniques that went into that. Now we're just talking specifically about the weapon-mounted light itself. When it comes to practice with just the weapon-mounted light, the biggest things that we have to focus on is manipulating the light itself, when to turn it on, when to turn it off, and how to handle the light as efficiently as possible. Now, there are two schools of thought when it comes to how the light should be employed. So let's look at the two schools of thought when it comes to the weapon-mounted light. And these apply to handheld lights as well, and rifle-mounted lights, but generally you have two schools of thought, and that is momentary only and constant on when needed. Momentary only is exactly what it sounds like. I'll use the momentary only feature of my light. I'm using a stream light here in this case, and as I'm a left-handed shooter, it's going to be rocker up for my momentary, which means as soon as I let off that rocker, the light goes off. Not so great for a left-handed shooter, but as a right-handed shooter, it's rocker down, so it makes a lot of sense. So I hold down on that rocker, I can engage my threat, and when I'm done shooting, I can just rocker off and the light turns off, and that's great. The problem I have with momentary only as a default instead of just an option is people get in a habit of, because they shoot paper, they'll engage, and as soon as they're done with their engagement, just by this natural habit, they'll immediately turn the light off. You may still need that light to evaluate your threat, and that's one of the problems that I see not only in low light classes, live fire, but I see it in force on force classes a lot, where guys have either taught themselves that method or they've been taught that method. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, but let's look at the context of why we needed the light in the first place. We needed the light to either control our threat or to provide data, or a combination thereof. If I'm giving up my data after I've literally bang, 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 and then the light goes off, my threat may not be incapacitated, and now I've given up my light. Not only may I lose really quality vision of my threat that was being illuminated by my light, but I may lose the light control that I had. So if you're going to use momentary only, you definitely have to consider the fact that the gun doesn't shoot magic bullets, and the light may still be needed after the engagement. So don't practice for a default mode of operation. Get used to the idea that you may engage your threat and then keep your light on, because not only may you have confronted that one threat, but you may have to look for additional threats, or you may already know of additional threats, or any number of possible situations where the light may be needed. I'm not saying momentary only is a bad technique to practice. That requires a bit more of an in-depth conversation because it's not my default method of operation. But you definitely have to think a little bit harder about what am I doing and why am I doing it. If you can't think of a strong reason either way, consider the context of what you're practicing for and what the light actually gives you. Now, our next camp of thought when it comes to weapon-mounted lights is constant on. And it's exactly what it sounds like. I draw the gun, the light gets turned on, and I use my normal two-handed shooting position. And I'm able to engage my threat, and then I just turn the light off when I know I no longer need it. I like this method because it gives me my traditional two-handed shooting grip, or my traditional one-handed shooting grip, because there's no way to use momentary only without some sort of pressure pad switch when you shoot one-handed with the lights that are out there currently. A good thing about constant on, like I said, one of the things is it gives us our traditional shooting grip, and it removes one thing from the menu of things that I have to focus on, and it doesn't force me to use an unorthodox grip that I may not have as much reps with. If you don't get a lot of time to shoot under low light conditions, you may be not as used to that grip. Can that grip affect your ability to shoot accurately? The type of light you're using is definitely going to dictate that. I'm in the Streamlight camp, but I spent a lot of years using Surefire products, and one thing I definitely noticed with Surefire products, especially when I was forced to use a 40 caliber handgun, is the Momentary only on the Surefire X300 is you press in on that rear panel instead of using the rocker switch. It seemed like unless I was just driving forward consciously with way too much pressure, every round the light would jump off my thumb. Not a huge deal, except now the light's being turned off when I didn't want it to be. And another factor to that is if I was pressing in, and with 9mm I didn't really have that problem. So with a 9mm I could press in hard enough and I would shoot and the light wouldn't go off, but my thumb was pressing in so hard that it was driving my accuracy in a direction that I didn't want the gun to go. So I was actually pushing the muzzle against the pressure I was delivering with my other hand. Kind of an issue for me. It's much easier for me to just go constant on, use my traditional shooting grip, and then when I consciously don't need the light anymore, instead of some trained response, I can just roll the light off and I'm done with my engagement. Now I'll probably do a video in the future about the pros and cons of both methods. It's not really what the video is about. You have to choose one, or you can use both, situation dependent. One thing I will say is, don't think of it in a vacuum. Consider the light method that you choose in implication of a traditional setting where you normally find yourself. When you walk outside your house at 10:30 at night, how much ambient light is there? Is Momentary only, because one of the biggest selling points for Momentary only has been when I turn the light off, I disappear. And that's not necessarily the case. If there's enough light for your threat to attack you without his own flashlight or his own night vision or whatever, then there's probably enough light for him to see you to actually make that decision to begin with. Very rarely do these altercations and situations where light is needed take place in an environment that is so dark that without the light on, you can't be seen. Now, indoors, people say, well, what about inside? If there's a guy creeping around your house, he's probably got pretty well adjusted night vision. And the argument made is, well, I blind him with my light and then I turn my light off and I disappear. And that may or may not be the case. This is something that you have to kind of shake out for yourself. I would say a Momentary only technique is going to be more useful indoors than it would be outdoors in more ambient light, but I can't say because I don't know what everybody's housing situation is. I don't know what kind of light is naturally coming into your windows and things of that nature. So that really has to be kind of a separate video topic. So what we're going to talk about is, regardless of the method you use, some of the ways and some of the things that we have to think about when we're practicing just manipulating the handgun itself using the weapon mounted light. So you remember from the last video I talked about some of the ways that we can talk about beam placement and some of the ways that we can practice it in daylight conditions. Tinfoil is a good medium because it's reflective. So if I have the light of my firearm properly placed on my target, I should get some feedback from that reflective material that I've placed on the target. The biggest issue, potential issue we have with a weapon mounted light is it's married to the muzzle, which is good and bad. It's good because we don't necessarily have to think about it. The light's going to point where the gun is pointed, and that's a good thing as long as proper techniques are observed. When we're talking about dealing with a threat, the safest place to point the firearm is going to be at the threat. The issue is if we're using the hot spot for control, if it's a judgment type shooting, like we're trying to get this guy to not get shot, we're giving him verbal commands based on the context and then how safe it is to give those verbal commands, the feasibility of those verbal commands, the prudence of those verbal commands, my hot spot should be somewhere like his face. And the reason for that is we want to remove his visual horizon. This is something you can practice yourself. Take your weapon light off your handgun and vary distances and see how far back you can get where the light actually removes your ability to get data at all, to actually see anything behind the light, such as the person holding it. I've got the light in his face. Good. Problem is, if I have to shoot, potential problem I should say, if I have to shoot, either my point of aim needs to remain on the face, or I have to transition the beam to where I'm going to shoot, which is probably going to be the high thoracic, because that's where a lot of shooters default to. So if I'm aimed in on my threat and I don't feel confident in my ability to get the headshot based on the distance or the situation, when it comes time to shoot, I got to bring the beam down to the chest. Not really that big of a deal because I'm about to deliver accurate gunfire. Now, giving up that visual horizon control with the weapon light means I'm going to allow him to have some degree of data, and this is why the brighter the light, the better. The problem that I've seen with shooters is they usually default beam to the chest and they start issuing verbal commands. If the hot spot isn't in your threat's face, if your maximum candela output of your light is not in your threat's face, he's able to see something. It may not be much because the brighter the light, the better, like we talked about, but if you're using one of these if you have an older light, such as like one of these Surefire Legacy lights or like 170 lumens max, or you're using one of these new popular concealed carry lights that are like 200, 170, 200 lumen output, If your beam's on his chest and the hot spot is on his chest and all he's getting in the face is a little bit of the flood from the light, he's probably able to see you reasonably well. And that can be an issue. If we take away his ability to take data in, we screw with his ability to process the situation. And I'm not saying that because it's a theory. I'm saying it because over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of evolutions under force on force, and seeing guys react to light on the street, having them at light point and weapon point, gun point if you will, seeing how they react when light is delivered in a good way versus seeing how they react when light is delivered in kind of a not so good way or just a very, very inefficient way altogether. So maintaining light control is important, but that also dictates default point of aim and where we're going to shoot when we have to shoot. So just like we talked about in the last video, working most likely to least likely. What is the most likely distance I'm liable to encounter a threat to the least likely? And the least likely doesn't mean it's impossible, it just means I'm going to start with common interaction distances and then work my way back towards what's not as probable, but still possible. Now, I'm not trying to predict the future so much as I am thinking about the demographic I'm facing, what I normally encounter, where I normally go, the size of the environments that I'm normally in. And that dictates a lot. If you live in a semi-rural area, your engagement distance may be somewhat further than those who live in the city, and the largest open environment they're liable to be in is either inside of a grocery store or outside in a parking lot. And then you think about human interaction distances and what's the likelihood? Are we talking about a profit crime? I would say that requires someone to be a little bit closer because the thief has to verbally threaten you and take from you that which he's demanding. So the distance is going to be closer. I'm not going to say how far, or I should say how close, but I would say that there's going to be a compression of distance. A passion crime, John from the office is mad at you for whatever reason, that distance can be a little bit farther depending on what he's choosing to do. And then a random act of violence, all bets are kind of off because the violence may not be immediately directed towards you. So most likely to least likely. Now, one of my preferred methods for, especially for the WML, just WML practice, is I'm going to draw out or transition from my handheld in whatever way I'm going to do it, and I'm going to get my hotspot control. Now, at this distance, I'm fairly confident in my ability to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rapid headshots on this piece of paper pretty damn quick. But I have to be prepared for the fact that I can't always get that headshot, even though that's what I want based on this distance. So I also have to variate, or I should say also create a variation of this particular drill in the fact where I go to the high thoracic. But my beam is always going to try to go to the face. So I'm out of the holster, I get my light control in the face. And then my light's off and I'm done. Round count is completely dependent on how much ammo you have to take to the range with you. For me, regardless of where I'm going to shoot, so let's say the next time I come out, beam goes to the face, but I'm like, okay, I can't get it down to the chest, and then I'm going to bring my beam back to where the head would be. It's a piece of paper. It's not going to go anywhere. But had that been a real human being, I'd like to think I delivered some pretty good accurate hits to very critical regions of the body. The beam is going to come back to the face if the face is still there. If the threat goes to the ground, I'm obviously going to follow him down. And at some point, once I'm reasonably sure he's been incapacitated, I can bring my gun back in, maybe turn my light off if I don't need it, reevaluate the situation around me. Variation on the drills are speed, quality of light placement. And that's why I love the tinfoil, because it keeps you from getting lazy even in the daytime. It's kind of dumb, but it works, so it's not that dumb after all. How far back can you take this? That's kind of your personal estimation. I will tell you this. In actual daylight, in overcast you can get away with a little bit more, but in actual daylight, especially if you don't have a high lumen, high candela output light, the tinfoil is only really going to help you out in those reasonable distances between arm's distance and like back to 5, maybe 7 yards. Beyond that, the tinfoil doesn't really do the trick, which is unfortunate, because the whole point of these videos is how do we practice low light techniques if we don't have ready and reasonable and regular access to a place where we can shoot when it's dark. So now we get into the real big point of contention with especially the handheld weapon mounted light. Constant on versus momentary only, reloading. Do you turn the light off? Do you leave the light on? And my answer to that is it depends. What kind of conditions am I in? If I'm on my threat and I'm using constant on or momentary, and I'm pretty reasonably sure now I've reached a reload situation. Do I turn the light off or do I leave the light on? It depends. The one thing I don't want to do is reload the gun and then come back and turn my light back on and be like, where'd that guy go? He was just right here and now he's gone. if there's enough ambient light that I feel like I could reload the gun and still be able to maintain at least a reasonable visual on my threat, even if he goes from very well lit in natural light color to just kind of a vague shape in the darkness, at least I have a rough idea of where he is, so if he starts moving, I can keep track of him, because the human eye does track movement relatively well in low light conditions. Now your pupils are liable to be a little bit saturated from the light that you're using, but that's okay. You should, ambient light depending, still be able to track that person. Should, and that's the problem. This is where I'd say don't get into a default method of operation. If I'm in a darker environment or my engagement was at a greater distance, I might keep the light on roughly in his area so I have data, perform my reload in a somewhat unorthodox way that I'm probably used to, and now I can get back on my threat. Now I'm like, okay, I can turn my light off, I can move. Movement, should you move? It depends on where you're at. If you're in the open, during your reload, it might be a good idea to seek cover or some sort of concealment or some kind of barrier at the very least. If you're already in a pretty reasonable position of advantage, say you're already standing behind a car and you understand what's good and what's not about the vehicle, or you have the edge of a wall or a tree or a bush or some kind of barrier or whatever, what kind of weapon am I facing? If I'm facing a firearm, my considerations for cover are much greater. If I'm facing a guy with a knife, I really don't need cover so much as I just need some sort of physical barrier between him and me, because he's got to touch me with the knife in order to hurt me with it. Unless he throws it, which is possible, but I think unlikely based on information that's out there. So I could literally just get a big jersey cone between him and me, and I'm good. He's got to get around the cone to hurt me. Now, obviously I would prefer something larger, but if that's what's there, that's what's there. So I don't believe in the hard and fast yes or no when it comes to should the light go off when you reload. It depends. And my personal advice to you as you practice is to get used to doing it both ways so you've got options on the table based on the context of the situation. Another thing that we should definitely practice, because it's important, we practice one-hand shooting. We should practice one-hand shooting as often as we can. Not necessarily because, and I brought this up countless times at this point, our other hand is going to be injured so much as we just may need it for something else, such as, you know, protecting someone, moving something, holding something, keeping a loved one behind us, grabbing onto something, working a handheld flashlight. But in this case, we're talking about firing the handgun with a weapon-mounted light, which is where weapon-mounted light definitely comes in handy. Not only, like I said, if this hand's injured, but think about scooping up your kid in like a home defense situation or pulling your child behind you. I can activate the weapon light with my my primary finger there, my index finger, my trigger finger, if you will. Go constant on, get my one-handed engagement done, and I can still manipulate the light with that finger. Problem being, momentary only is not really going to be a thing unless you're using some kind of DG switch or pressure pad, depending on the type of the light that you're using. Final thing about reloads, environment dictates a lot, and not just what I was talking about, ambient light, how much ambient light is available, what kind of environment are you in? If I'm indoors, my technique may vary as well. The unorthodox, when I called an unorthodox position, is maintaining light on your thread even though you're at slide lock, and performing that reload in a way that maybe you're not used to unless you shoot IDPA and they're big about the whole muzzle up thing or whatever. But consider in an indoor environment, I got my sight picture, go to slide lock. When I go, if I leave the light on and I go muzzle up like I've trained to perform my reload, consider that that light is now umbrella lighting and illuminating me. Is that bad? Is it good? Context matters. Not only is the light up during my reload going to illuminate me, it may illuminate me and the room so I can still see my threat. So I don't have to keep the beam on him. Now, is that going to be a bad thing? Depends. Remember, we're talking about a reload, so you fired whatever the capacity of your firearm is. So you may be reloading, and we're talking about a slide lock reload, you may be reloading because you need that ammo immediately because whatever the capacity of your gun was, it didn't get the job done. Or maybe it got the job done on one guy and there's more threats than that. Now, if it's just a tactical reload or an emergency reload, and my definition of emergency reload is getting more ammunition in the gun without worrying about slide lock, without going to slide lock. My definition of a tactical reload is reloading the gun kind of at your leisure. I don't believe in the whole lull in the gunfight quote because I don't know what that feels like. I don't know when it starts. I don't know when it ends. And I don't want to think, is this the lull? And then as soon as I go to start, oh, lull's over. So I don't really like that terminology because I feel like it's a little bit misleading and very simplistic. So lighting, and the environment is definitely going to can be a hindrance, and it can be an advantage based on context. Remember, we talked about kind of threat am I facing? Does he have a gun? Does he not have a gun? That definitely dictates some of the ways I'm going to do things. Now, if I were to leave my light on and it needlessly endangered me, when I talk about indoors, if I go muzzle up, I'm going to umbrella light. The brighter my light is, the higher quality of light that's going to come down. That's why you put lights in the ceiling, because that's the best way for them to disperse the light on the ground. If you have a handheld light or a weapon-mounted light, and you've never shined it at your ceiling in a semi-dark to dark room, try it out and see just how quality of light that spreads all around the environment. Brighter the light, higher the quality. So that's something to consider as well. Now, goes back to the ambient light question. If you turn the light off, is the ambient light already good enough to see you anyway? And if the answer is yes, then my answer to you is it doesn't matter if you turn the light off or not. It really doesn't. But if by turning the light, or by leaving the light on, you're going to needlessly endanger yourself, because remember, we're talking about slide lock reload, fired all that ammunition and I'm reloading in an emergency situation, I'm kind of in a hurry, to me that dictates that I might need that ammo that I'm putting in the gun. So maybe I forget to turn my light off, or maybe I leave my light on and that needlessly endangers me, or maybe I turn my light off and then lose sight of my threat. Those are three possibilities. There are more variation possibilities, of course, but those are the three things that can happen. So if you practice only one of them, you can fall victim to the others. So environment's going to dictate, practice it all in every way that you can. So you basically, instead of creating this rote memorized methodology of technique, light always goes off, reload always happens, muzzle up, slide forward, light back on after I move. Maybe moving doesn't make sense. Maybe not practice that as a default method of operation. Most of the ranges that we practice on are very wide open squares or rectangles. And we may bring cover in to talk specifically about cover, but it's normally not available, especially, topic of this video, people who don't have access to ranges like that. Moving might not be a bad idea. Moving might be a horrible idea based on whatever position you have. If you have access to an outdoor range, leave cover on the range all the time. Leave concealment on the range all the time. Leave barriers on the range all the time. So if you just happen to have one, just get used to the idea of, okay, if that was there and this was a situation, that's where I would go. If you're forced to shoot indoors, you're going to have to practice that stuff under dry fire, which is fine. You got plenty of furniture in your house, move things around, and you may feel silly doing it, but at least you're priming yourself to think about always wanting to improve your physical position. Always look for a position of advantage. Outside of that, the weapon-mounted light comes down to accuracy. Biggest reason, I already talked about the reason why I don't like holding momentary only, is because it compromises my traditional shooting grip, the grip that I probably have spent more time with. Now, I could invest a ridiculous amount of ammunition, and I say ridiculous because it would take me a ridiculous amount of ammunition to catch up versus how much ammunition I fired the way that I shoot now. I can still use momentary only. I can shoot as well. I can't shoot as fast, which to me bothers me because I want to shoot as fast as the situation is going to allow, because the more bullets I get to my threat, the faster I get them there, the quicker he will be incapacitated. Because, of course, my focus is not shooting paper, it's practicing to shoot people in the event that I have to, or I'm forced to, I should say. So consider that if you're going to subscribe to momentary only and that's the only technique you're going to use, you can practice shooting that way pretty easily without the need to have access to a place where you can shoot under actual low light conditions. Just be honest with yourself. And that's where, the silly little thing with the tinfoil comes into play, is it shows you where your flashlight beam is, and it shows you where its placement is, and it shows you how much it comes off your target during recoil based on how you're holding the light and what kind of light you're using. There's some lights out there like the Enforce lights where the paddles are in. Try doing momentary hold only on one of those at reasonable distances, shooting self-defense ammunition, especially if you're one of those guys that carries the plus P ammo. I think you'll find that it's going to be a little bit aggravating to maintain that thumb pressure and maintain the accuracy that you're used to at the cadence that you're used to. So these are just all things that we have to consider when we practice. I wanted to make these videos to give you a way to think about things that maybe you hadn't considered in the past. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.